Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Blind Guardian, titled Beyond the Red Mirror. I've said before that it's hard to talk about legends, especially as a critic, and especially when you know that these bands have had a seminal impact on shaping their respective genre. But you know what's even harder? Talking critically about musical acts that were so formative to my musical evolution that I couldn't imagine being a music critic without hearing this band, who I first discovered in the mid-2000s on clunky fantasy fan sites as they were making music to a favorite novel series that I was reading at the time. Now, I was a teenager absorbed in Dragonlance series of books, and I discovered that at that time, two metal bands actually wrote songs surrounding a couple of the characters from those stories. Now, I'll talk about the second band in a month or so when they release their album, but the first, now keep in mind, at this point, I pretty much only listened to pop, hip-hop, and country, with limited exposure to rock and pretty much no metal. And I had never gone through an angry white boy phase. I had no reason whatsoever to listen to new metal or metalcore or even a lot of punk. But I'd heard about this song from this fan site and I was curious. The song was called The Soul Forge, the album was A Night at the Opera, and the band was Blind Guardian. It might have taken 3 or 4 listens, but I was hooked. And from there, I started listening to power metal and symphonic metal. The folk tinges pushed me towards fantasy themed folk acts like Blackmore's Night, which led me to Deep Purple and hard rock and blues. And the explosive, fast-paced, chugging riffs, they pushed me towards the greats of thrash metal and punk. Now, the rest for me is history, but I think I can say this definitively. If it wasn't for Blind Guardian and that song, I probably would not have this channel talking about music here today. And thus, revisiting the band is a little bit daunting for me. Half because of their reputation, and half because I know so much of their music by heart. Hailing from Germany, they started out as a speed metal band in the mid-80s before transitioning to a more epic, fantasy-inspired scope with Tales from the Twilight World in 1990. Now, plenty of fans hailed the Tolkien-inspired Nightfall and Middle-earth as their seminal work from the 90s, but for me, it's always been Imaginations from the Other Side, the perfect blend of their speed metal roots and the folk-inspired power metal that they would evolve into, and it's a damn classic in my books. But that evolution reached its apex with 2002's A Night at the Opera, a title that matched the overblown Queen-like bombast of its sound that features some of my favorite Blind Guardian songs ever, like The Soul Forge, Battlefield, Sadly Sings Destiny, and, of course, the gargantuan 14-minute epic And Then There Was Silence. But the record really is indulgent upon retrospect and a lot more uneven than you might think. It was enough so that their drummer Thomas Staunch left the band dissatisfied by the change in direction. And by all reckoning, he might have spoken a little bit too soon because Blind Guardian changed again in 2006 with A Twist in the Myth, with less over-the-top bombast and more of a straightforward, hard-hitting thrash feel. And not only was the production a heck of a lot stronger, the drumming of Frederick Umke was more intricate, varied, and wasn't as reliant on triggers for the drum fills, which I definitely preferred. It didn't hit all the extreme high points of A Night at the Opera, those epic moments, but I'd argue it's a lot more consistent and a lot tighter. Unfortunately, that didn't exactly carry over for the 2010 album At the Edge of Time, which, okay, yeah, it wasn't bad, but that tightness for me wasn't there, which led that the album had a lot of pomp and bombast, but not quite the great hooks or the great songs to really stick the landing, at least for me. But now, 5 years later, Blind Guardian, they're back with Beyond the Red Mirror, an album that's being hailed as a sequel to Imaginations from the Other Side. And let's be honest, it's been 20 years from that album, and if you're planning to make a sequel to one of the best power metal albums ever made, you better do it justice. I had to admit I was worried going into this. Did Blind Guardian manage to pull it off? Well, a few things become important before we get to that conversation. Namely that Blind Guardian has made Imaginations from the Other Side. It's a very different band than the one that made Beyond the Red Mirror today. But make no mistake, there is a lot of ambition and stabs at grandeur on this record, and for the most part, they really do manage to stick the landing on one of their strongest records since A Twist in the Myth, balancing the progressive and symphonic sides with the ability to craft a really strong, great melodic hook. As for the concept, well, okay, we'll get to it, but if you're a fan of symphonic-flavored power metal, Beyond the Red Mirror by Blind Guardian will not disappoint. Not in the slightest. So I think the best place to start would be in the production and the instrumentation. And really, to some extent, if you've been listening to Blind Guardian in any way across the past couple of decades, you will immediately recognize their sound. It's that iconic. Andre Olbrich still has a knack for killer melody lines. Marcus Saipen's rhythm guitars bring together some great chugging grooves, and the addition of full-time bassist Baron Courbois adds some significant meaty crunch, which I definitely liked and I thought was really appropriate, considering the much greater symphonic touches with the usage of 3 distinctive backing choirs and orchestras. One from Prague, one from Budapest, and one from Boston. And I must give some serious credit to Frederick Umke's drum work, which always manages to surprise me with some layered and starkly progressive patterns that really really stood out for me, and they really step up to deliver some stellar moments on this album. The glitchier industrial fragments and horns on the ninth wave, that fantastic drum progression on Twilight of the Gods that I really liked, that eerie twinkle on At the Edge of Time that leads to one of the best hooks on the album and easily outstrips the majority of the album that shares its name, the fiery cascade of a guitar solo on Ashes of Eternity that leads to this really clattering chorus that I liked, the fantastic soaring melodic interplay on the bonus track Distant Memories, one of the softer songs in terms of the groove but still great, the skittering panic of the throne, and the biggest surprise for me, the Queen-like piano ballad Miracle Machine that actually turns out to be one of the most understated and gorgeous tracks that Blind Guardian has ever made. And of course, Hansi Kirsch as a frontman is incredibly impressive. The guy's one of the most potent and expressive voices in power metal, and his usage of plenty of overdubs only accentuates that huge presence. And it's a natural fit for dimension-crossing epic journeys like the ones described on this album. Now, if I were to have one nitpick when it comes to some of the vocals, it'd be in some of the production and delivery. I do miss some of the more visceral howls that came from Blind Guardian's speed metal days. And whether this could have been achieved through turning up the vocals a little bit in the mix, or Hansi Kirsch delivering just a little bit more fire, I do think they could have been just a little bit more raw and passionate, at least for me. Now, this inevitably takes us to the lyrics, and let me try to describe the plot of this album the best I can. Following off of Imaginations from the Other Side, the mirrors that once bridged the gaps between the world of science fiction, which is clearly a metaphor for our world, and the world of fantasy and imagination, the mirrors have been shattered one by both worlds taking a serious turn for the worse. The sci-fi world is falling into dystopian ruin, and the fantasy world appears to be dominated by devilish powers as the old gods have gone to sleep. As such, the loosely sketched protagonist from our previous album must find that last remaining mirror, bridge the gap, fulfill the prophecy, and somehow manage to find the truth and save both worlds through the discovery of the Holy Grail. Now let's make this clear. Blind Guardian are playing fast and loose with classical iconography. This is not so much the classically defined, clearly defined storytelling of Arion, but much more of a tale that works in metaphor and a lot of broad symbolism. As such, following the actual plot of this story, especially considering Hansi Kirsch is playing all of the characters, it can be difficult at best. Now, to be fair, this is power metal. If the story isn't convoluted and hyperbolic, simultaneously underwritten in terms of the plot and yet overwritten in terms of the detail, they wouldn't be in this genre. I can forgive a lot here. But keep in mind that there are thematic elements that can be traced together if you choose to go deeper. For one, the returning protagonist seems to begin the story as a soldier for destroying that old order in the sci-fi world, taking a brand of almost militant atheism to annihilate the old gods in their fantastic ways. And while he can't quite destroy them, he can break the gates to their world, even despite apocryphal prophecies foretelling their return, and that he might be the one to fulfill those prophecies and fix things. And when he reaches the Red Mirror, that last gate, he's confronted with the horrific destruction that he's wrought, and stricken with guilt, he wanders through that red door to find some form of solace, a grail that might redeem him, be able to fulfill those prophecies. And of course, he does find the grail, a little bit too quickly, honestly, and tries to send it back, first trying to defeat the dark tyrant that rules the fantasy world, and yet the tyrant retorts that said salvation that our protagonist is trying to bring to his world might be going to the wrong hands, and he's not wrong. In the next song, it is, as the sci-fi side surges through the Red Mirror with a zealotry that can only be described as religious. And thus our hero used the Grail, a symbol of magic and faith, wrought with machinery to seal that final gate, the Miracle Machine, to define a new truth and create a path of enlightened reason, with only a fragment of hope and belief in the otherworldly to come. One last lie that he knows really is all the more true. So okay, what does all that mean? Well, on the broadest level, it's a screed against religious fanaticism, the servants of fire who will blindly destroy everything in their wake without reason, and how those who think they serve to enlighten humanity by bringing a new way can often be just as deluded and only replace one set of old gods with another. Not a new concept, mind you, considering the Warhammer 40,000 Horus Heresy series has near identical themes in their earlier books, but it's still well executed here. In this case, Blind Guardian casts the sci-fi gods under the vein of Scientology on Sacred Mind, and isn't afraid to unleash a pretty impressive stream of bile against them in the subtext as the real demons, the real bad guys of this album. It's not saying that the old structures were better, but that balanced reason is what needs to hold sway. And yet if you view the sci-fi world as our own, and the fantasy world as the imaginary one where one creates fantasies and beliefs, the metaphor actually grows even further, as Grand Parade shatters those beliefs, those false religions, and allows the other world to materialize for all, merging the worlds and bringing imagination to cross to all men, and yet leaving one lie behind. The lie of what comes after death. That last great mystery, that one great solace. So why is it left behind? Well, Ultimately, it's the one mystery that we all still need. Now, this is an ambitious story, and at the end of the day, I think Blind Guardian does do a really good job with it, and I really do love a lot of the concepts, but I can't help but feel it could have been executed a little bit better. The album definitely could have used an editor to trim back some of Blind Guardian's more indulgent side, but then again, overblown indulgence is half the reason people come to power metal in the first place, and Blind Guardian definitely have the melodic compositions and instrumental prowess to back up the over-the-top sound. So yeah, for me, yeah, the streak of great albums continues, because this definitely gets an 8 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation if you're a fan of this sort of fantasy-inspired power metal. Yeah, from the outside, it can come across as a little bit cheesy, but like the best of power metal, I think it goes beyond that, and earns the right to be called epic. Definitely check this one out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, or anything else I might be able to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.